Hey, Joseph or JSB here on Acting is Reacting, and today I'm very happy to be joined by author and fellow YouTuber Tim Durling. Tim's now got 5 books published on various music topics, including this one on Kansas, a top 5 band for me if you follow this channel for long, and his latest, which just came out in June on US 80s melodic rock stars Night Ranger. So we will be discussing those books and those bands and much more besides. So welcome, Tim, to the channel, and I'm really glad to have you here and talking about, well, you've got 5 books, but we're primarily talking about 2 of them. One that matches your t-shirt, which is Let It Be Your Guide, the Kansas album review for a nice snap, and Sing Me Away, the Night Ranger album review. So would you like to start off with a little bit of background about yourself and how these books and your other ones came to be?
Sure, Joseph. Thanks for having me on the channel. This is fantastic. It was quite by accident. It was I would say post COVID, when the advent of Zoom and such platforms became, I guess first they became part of work, and then it was discovered, hey, I can do this. I can actually do something fun with this. So I started, communicating with people who, I'd only ever like messaged or emailed, or I've never corresponded with in any way, and I started appearing on shows like The Contrarians, and my my friends just expanded. People that I can talk about music with, and in the midst of doing all that, I guess my first book, Unspooled, which is subtitled An Adventure in 8 Tracks, that was the beginning. That sprang out of a conversation. Well, I should say the idea had been germinating for many, many years in my head, what I wanted to do with that. But it really came from a conversation I had with my friend Martin Popoff, who's a very well-known rock writer,
Yeah,
also in Canada. We're totally different parts of the country, but I had the pleasure of getting to know him, and then in doing that, we spoke about this idea, and he said, "I think I think you've got a book here." And I remember thinking, well, if Martin Popoff thinks that I've got a book here, then I should go for it. So, with the help of
definitely.
my good friend Matt Phillips, who's a designer, his company is called Go North Design. He's worked on all of my books, and the reason they look as good as they do and laid out is all because of him. So that book started as a Kickstarter campaign. It did really well, exceeded our expectations. Totally blew us away. The response to this, I guess you
Great.
could call it a coffee table book. And then, so that was a Kickstarter, like I said. Then we discovered that you could put books out on a print to order basis through Amazon. And that sounded very appealing because that takes the shipping, that takes the mailing and the packaging and the taping and the paying for all of that out of the equation.
Yeah. And
And
speaking of Martin, he's
once,
having great problems with that at the minute with the tariffs and everything. I was going to ask you about that
oh,
a bit
I guess,
later, but
yeah, very much so. I feel bad. I mean, honestly, there were times that I think, I should probably have a publisher. And then, in light of this, I think, I think I'm in a pretty good situation right now. I think I'm going to, because these are print on demand and you can order them wherever your home country is. If it's in the UK, you order from Amazon UK. If you're in Australia, it's wherever your local Amazon is, the print to order. So I'll never have a situation, I did with the Kickstarter campaign. There'll never be a situation where I've got boxes of books. And it's like, what am I going to do with these? I've gotten
yeah,
this much money in, and so yeah, you do it through Amazon. Yes, they take a bit of, a big chunk of the money, but you just don't have to worry about the shipping, and it's great. It works for me. So my first, once I got that out of the way, I really wanted to do a book. Um, and I guess the first book I did that was on one artist in particular was a band that's been a favorite of mine for years and years, and I think that they're one of those bands that should have been household names, and that's Y&T. Um, that's that was the first one that I did. It's called Down for the Count. I was very fortunate in making the acquaintance of the legend that is Hugh Syme to do the artwork for that book.
yeah,
That was a
amazing.
mind-blowing experience. That sold very well. That book, the Y&T book, remains my biggest seller by a pretty wide margin. There'd never been a book on this band before. I don't know how familiar you are with them, but they're
Yeah,
we've
not very much. I'm kind of aware, but without ever, I don't think I've ever heard even a track from them, let alone an album. Which,
well,
but
I'll
the look on
tell
your
you,
face is saying you got to rectify that. Yes, I know.
it's great hard rock, and in the Van Halen sort of tradition, I guess that's the easiest comparison I can make. They came out in the '70s, and just great melodic hard rock, bordering on what you might call old school metal. They've long been a favorite of mine. But my next book, and one of the ones that we're going to concentrate on, it was the Kansas one because I'm an enormous fan of Kansas, and there have been books. I know Carrie Livgren has done a couple of books. There have been books out on Kansas or members of Kansas, but there's never been one quite like this.
Yeah,
And this one and the Y&T and the Night Ranger all follow the same format, which I borrowed from Martin, and he knows that because he's in the Y&T one. His album by album series of books, which is when you get a panel of people that you ask them all the same questions about the same albums, and then you print their answers as if a bunch of people are sitting around talking about a particular album. You say, I think the production on this album is better than the one before it. And then you say, no, I actually think it's not as good. It's a discussion. And through that, I learn things, and it gets me thinking about albums I've listened to for years in a different way. So this Kansas one was just the next logical step. I knew I wanted to do one of these. And like a lot of bands, they continue to make new music into the
yeah,
21st century. I think that their previous two albums, so Prelude Implicit, which came out in 2016, and The Absence of Presence, which came out in 2020, are two of their finest albums ever. Yes, there have been a lot of lineup changes, but so many of these bands either stop making new music and they just tour and tour and tour and tour.
yeah.
But
When we
but
say
when they
cough, cough, foreigner.
very much so. Very. That's always the band that comes to mind. I love Foreigner, but they stopped. They just
Yeah,
stopped being a creative force. And I really admire bands that keep putting out albums no matter how they sell or don't sell. But the trouble
yeah,
is that usually you end up on these sort of smaller labels, whether it's Frontiers Records or you name it, and they just don't get out there and on the shelves in the public eye. But I wanted to give them equal credence. Like to me, I wanted to go through every studio album, and I don't care if it was on a major label or not. I don't care if it sold 2 million copies or 20,000 copies. I just don't, it doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is the music, and finding enough people that know enough about all the albums and lining the panelists up. Yeah, the Kansas book turned out exceptionally well. I love the cover. Matt
yeah,
did this cover with a little bit of AI help, but it's one of those. It's like a nice gatefold cover from days of old, where the more you look at it, if you're really familiar with the iconography in the Kansas discography, you can point out different things. Okay. There's the bearded guy. Okay, there's a ship. You know, there's
yeah. On the back.
there's a violin. There's an anvil. There's a World War II plane.
Oh, I missed the anvil, I've got to say.
There's a lot of things. I mean, I forget about some of the stuff we put in there. There's in the boat, you can see that there's a face, which is based on the Mask
Oh,
album.
Mask. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, and there's
Yeah. So there's plenty more to discover each time, then.
yeah, there's
Like the classic album covers of old.
this is supposed to be a monolith in the background.
Okay.
So and I laugh because it came out so well that I don't even mind that he's got 1 foot in the water. But no,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
absolutely love the music of Kansas, and I think that they're an incredibly versatile group. They're primarily called a progressive band, but they had an AOR phase, which I loved as well. They've got
Yeah.
heavier moments. I think they're incredibly versatile. I had the privilege of uh, John Elephant. I corresponded with him. Of course, he sang on Vinyl Confessions and Drastic Measures. I named my YouTube channel Tim's Vinyl Confessions. That should give you an idea of my fandom. My very first episode was about Kansas, so to actually have him answer some questions for me was pretty gratifying. Since the book came out, I've had the pleasure of speaking with Tom Brislin, who's their current keyboard player. I mean, he's played with a ton of people. He was in Yes briefly. He played with Meatloaf, and I did a nice interview with Tom. One of the big thrills is that a couple of dedicated fans who lived in I don't know if they lived in Topeka, Kansas, or if they were visiting, but they approached Kerry Livgren, the founder and the main songwriter in Kansas, and presented him with a copy of my book, and he actually posted about it on his Facebook page. And that,
Well,
I mean, that was great. I mean, that's
one of
Mr.
those moments,
Kansas,
yeah.
right? He hasn't been in the band for years, but he's the guy, right? I mean,
Yeah,
no
absolutely.
Kerry, no Kansas. So that was extremely, and it sold. It continues to sell. I still, the nice thing is when I put a new book out, like I did with the Night Ranger one, there's an effect where some of my previous books begin to sell as well. And
Yeah.
for such a long time music fan and a completist like me, it's so it's wonderful to think I've got a back catalog, you know. So there's something very, very, very cool about that when that
Well, it's
happens.
just what you say in the Kansas book is that whenever you get to your left overture, then your previous books are all going to go gold on the back of that. So
Yes, exactly. Yes. And books are a funny thing. I don't really know how you quantify, when you've quote unquote done well, but I do know that I've gotten a lot of these books out to a lot of people all over the world. And one of the best things that somebody can say to me about any of my books is that number one, they bought the book, they enjoyed it, but then they said, for example, Kansas, that somebody would say to me, I had the best of, or I had left overture and point of no return. I just went on Amazon and I ordered 4 of their CDs. I ordered some of their newer ones. Fantastic. That's the goal.
yeah, perfect. And you have got very impressive panels of people in these books. I mean, people who are familiar with the biggest and best YouTube rock channels will know a lot of the names in here are Brendan Snyder, Pete Pardo, Scott Lade, Stephen Reed, the list goes on. How do you, A, get all these people together and then allocate which particular albums they speak about?
Well, yeah, I've been very fortunate. A lot of it, some of these people I knew or kind of knew, or, knowing Martin Popoff honestly helps a lot
Opens
because
doors,
then,
yeah.
I'll say, hey, I'm friends with Martin Popoff and, I'm doing this. That's how I made the acquaintance of Pete Pardo. Through Pete, I got to know Scott. Brendan's a channel I followed for a long, long time anyway. And it's just a matter of reaching out to anybody that I can think of in my sort of circle and saying, hey, are you a Kansas fan? Or you might see someone on a show talking about them, so they're a fan. And then you just say, look, I'm working on something. I'm looking for someone to speak about all of the studio albums. And, if you could pick your top 5, say, what would they be? And it's first come, first serve. Obviously, most people are going to want to talk about Leftoverture, Point of No Return, Song for America. But when somebody comes along and they said, oh, I want to talk about In the Spirit of Things, I want to talk about Drastic Measures, Freaks of Nature, great. But after a while, you're like, hey, someone, is a little bit later getting back to me and says, hey, I'd really like to be in this book. I'll say, well, this is what I've got openings for now. And they'll say, look, I don't really know that album, but give me a chance to listen to it and I'll answer the question. So I've, I've made fans out of people that weren't Kansas fans before. I know that. And I've made bigger fans of people that only, like I said, only had a couple of their albums. So that's very gratifying. Look, I haven't had them set sales records, but I know that there's been a little
No, but
spike
yeah,
in in in,
exactly.
in
I
album
mean,
sales, which
any uplift is quite a big uplift in this day and age of actual sales of anything, as we know.
yeah.
Um, and I was kind of surprised actually because I assumed, clearly wrongly, that this would just be full of complete wheatheads who knew every album back to front. But there were even a couple of contributors who seemed to be quite new to the band at all, and that actually made quite an interesting addition because you're getting a really fresh perspective on things. And I mean, generally they're agreeing with everybody else that this is brilliant stuff that we're talking about.
Yeah, and every perspective is worthwhile. I mean, obviously, yeah, there are people that got into them way early, whether it was with the first album or maybe Song for America, and have seen them in concert countless times. And then there are people that, are much younger and, maybe they watched Supernatural on TV and got to know Carry On Wayward Son. And that's fine too if they're willing to learn and go back and listen. Their perspective is just as, a 1 year fandom is just as valid as a 30, 40 year fandom. And sometimes when you have someone that comes in and listens to something that you've had ingrained in your brain, for decades,
Yeah.
someone else might listen to it and think, "You ever notice this kind of sounds like this?" And no, I never noticed that before. That's interesting. So it's all, it's all there. Like, and another thing I really didn't want is to have everybody agree. The questions that I ask for the each chapter, each album, sometimes they're not questions. Sometimes they're a statement and you agree with it or you disagree with it. And I think you could kind of tell by the way I frame the questions, my general opinion on an album. This isn't about what I think of it, but I do interject that into the framing of the questions.
Yeah.
But I've had people say, no, I don't agree with that. I think it's actually quite good, or I think this is, or it's like, yeah, I don't think it's, everybody seems to like this one. I'm not so much into it, or it's all over the place. So it's all valid. And as long as people were, willing to really seriously give the music the time of day and then answer the questions and, not just give yes or no answers, then yeah, I did really, I lucked out with all my books. I've had so many great panelists. And once I get great panelists, I usually ask if they want to come back when I do another one.
So this is why the books keep getting bigger and bigger.
Well, the Night Ranger one, yeah, that's the biggest one yet. It's almost 300 pages, and I really wanted to max things, push it. And there are 10 panelists per chapter, per album chapter in the Night Ranger one. And I really wanted to do that. Now, it's not the same 10 every time. Some people
Yeah.
do 3 or 4 albums, some people do 9 albums, some people only do one, but they're all mixed in there. The Kansas one isn't quite like that. I think I've got 5 panelists per chapter,
Tends
but
to be 5 or 6, I think. Yeah.
yeah, but it's still, it's a good hefty read. I didn't want it to go on too long, but with the Night Ranger, I think maybe one of the reasons I wanted to do that with Kansas, they're a progressive rock band, so there's a lot to talk about in the intricacies of the music and the arrangements, and a lot of times the lyrics. What did he mean by that? What does this lyric signify? And with Night Ranger, they're just a great melodic rock band. And they're fantastic musicians. And I happen to think that Jack Blades is a great lyricist, but there isn't as much for one person to talk about, I didn't think. That's why I really wanted to get multiple perspectives on each of those albums.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I mean, when you're talking Jack Blades' lyricism, and I'm not putting him down at all, but when you compare him to Kerry Livgren's lyrics, it's a different beast.
It's just it's a different perspective. No, they're not. Jack Blades was never trying to be a progressive rock writer. He just wanted to write great rock songs. Kerry Livgren just wrote these grandiose songs, and so many of them he wrote himself. Like "Song for America," he wrote while he was on an airplane. That blows my mind because that is such a complex song, and
Yeah.
and I've brought it up different times. I'm a huge Kiss fan. Paul Stanley said he wrote Love Gun on a plane. Okay, that's cool. But Love Gun is not Song for America, It's
Yeah, I mean, you can't imagine. Planes, of course, in the 70s weren't packed out with what we expect and experience these days, but even still, I can't imagine having the peace of mind and the right frame of mind to come up with something as intricate as that. And I know with something like Song for America, when they came to record it, Phil Earhart has said that Kerry had all the parts written out for them. It was
yeah.
a complete piece. So
There are so
really
many movements in that
phenomenal.
song, and there are so many tempo changes and mood changes. And to think that he had all that mapped out in his head with the distraction of being on an airplane. Like he must have been able to just block everything out and just go into his own head. It's pretty amazing. And the thing is, there are a lot of songs he's written that are like that. When you Closet Chronicles and Cheyenne Anthem and like just there's so many.
Yeah. And now, I came to these books from two different perspectives, really, in that, like you, I'm a massive Kansas fan and have been for, I'd say, probably most of the century, but maybe slightly before that. Night Ranger, on the other hand, is a band that I feel like I should love, but they've never quite clicked for me. So I was curious to see how reading those two books would be a different experience for me from that perspective. And sure enough, uh, with the Kansas book, I'm hearing every single song as you're speaking about it. But the Night Ranger was interesting because you really, I mean, in both of these books, the passion for the subject from all people involved really comes through. And I'm reading every chapter and thinking, man, I need to hear this album at least. And then you get to the end and think, well, that's 13 albums I need to. I've got one of them. So, but there's an awful lot to catch up on. I mean, I have seen the band live, and that wasn't something that pushed them over. Sometimes it can take seeing a band live to make them click with you, and it didn't quite happen. I don't really know what it is. There's nothing I can put my finger on to say this is why they're not quite in my wheelhouse, because they're on paper exactly in my wheelhouse. So this has given me impetus to at least go and check out some of the ones that you've covered, which is obviously all of them. But from your point of view, if you are someone who's a melodic rock fan and hasn't heard these albums, what would be the two or three that you would turn someone onto as a starting point with this band?
For Night Ranger, I would definitely say, I think it's important to start from the beginning in this case, and it just so happens that Rock Candy Records, uh, 2 years ago, came out with wonderful new versions of Dawn Patrol and Midnight Madness. So 1982, 1983, the first two Night Ranger albums. Did a wonderful job at remastering them and cleaning them up. My I had those CDs for a long time. I had the old MCA CDs. They're very quiet, but they were able to restore. I noticed guitar parts that I'd never heard before. But if you can listen to those first two Night Ranger albums and say, no, I don't think so, well, then I just don't think there's a fan in you, and that's fine. Um, but that they really set, and Night Ranger is a band that they didn't have any floundering years as far as the first few albums they were finding their feet. They arrived complete. Their sound was intact. All of the guys in the band had sort of been kicking around in the music business for a few years.
Yeah,
They were all, I would say, late 20s. Maybe some of them were over 30 at this point. Not that that's old, but they had
in real
years of
terms, it can be. Yeah,
experience. Yeah, they had years of experience. So when they came out of the gate, they were a machine. They had two amazing guitar players in Brad Gillis and Jeff Watson. They had a very unique situation with the vocals where you had Jack Blades who played bass and sang, and Kelly Kagi who played drums and sang. So your rhythm section is your vocalists. Uh, and they sort of occupy a strange place in terms of, you know, if we must categorize these bands, because I've always considered there to be hard, it's speaking in 1980s parlance. There's hard rock bands, which I would say are Def Leppard and Whitesnake and Rat, bands like that. And then there are just rock bands, which are Foreigner and Journey and REO. Um, Night Ranger are somewhere in between. They have songs that rock really, really hard and they can be extremely melodic. So they cover a lot of bases, but I think that's one of the reasons that they sometimes slip through the cracks. Now they had a tremendous amount of success. They've got one song, Sister Christian, that will outlive all of us. It's become part of pop culture. But then you have a situation where, because that one song is so iconic and so instantly memorable, it becomes that situation where the song is better known than the band that created it.
yeah,
And with Kansas, I think that's changing a little bit. Kansas have two songs like that. They've got Carry On and they've got Dust in the Wind. And I think a lot of people, they know the name Kansas goes with those songs. Night Ranger, I don't know if people, if people know the song Sister Christian and you say who sings that, you might get a variety of guesses of 70s, 80s rock bands. And this is kind of my way of saying not only do I want to try and change that, I want people to know who they are, exactly what they did. And I also happen to think they've got a dozen or so songs that are every bit as worthy of being, the same thing with Y&T. Like, in all of these cases, I'm doing books on bands and artists that I admire greatly and sold, decent amounts of albums for the most part, gold records, platinum records, a few top 40 hits, but to me should be in that upper echelon. In other words, I think the best thing you could say is like, I think this band has about a dozen songs that we should all be sick of hearing,
Mhm.
you know.
Yeah, exactly. And it was interesting having Steve Deluxe in the Night Ranger book because he's a fellow Kiwi. I don't know if you know that I'm a Kiwi because most people don't spot it in the accent these days. So I grew up not hearing Night Ranger on the radio at all, including Sister Christian. Never heard Kansas on the radio, to my knowledge. So those big songs were things that I had read about but not actually experienced. So
I understand that, and in the case of Night Ranger, well, no, actually, in a lot of ways, both of those bands, their success mainly was limited to the United States. You know, Night Ranger until actually until just recently, Night Ranger played a grand total of two shows in Canada, one in
oh
1983
wow.
and one in 1984. Now they've got a couple of gigs coming up. I think there's one in Ontario and then there's one in Winnipeg. Now I'm on the eastern part of Canada, not even close, but at least they remember that there's a country up here. And Kansas, it's really they played up here, but it's just not the same thing. It doesn't get that concentration. Um, I'm not really sure why that is, but I also understand that you have to go where the audience is. You can't tour and lose your shirt. And I know from talking to Steve and talking to Peter Kerr and Rock Daydream Nation and Bicycle Legs, from Australia, New Zealand, that if I think Canada gets neglected, then then New Zealand and Australia really doesn't see a lot of these bands. And subsequently, you don't always hear them, or I know exactly what you mean. You know the titles, and then maybe eventually you'll hear part of it and go, oh, that's that song that I keep reading about or that I've been hearing about all this time. I totally understand that. Now, in the case of Night Ranger, I had one advantage that I write about in my introduction, that I grew up and I still kind of do live not very far from the US border. So I listened to as much American radio as I did Canadian radio. So that's where I got to know bands like not, Night Ranger in Kansas and I'll say 38 Special, bands that were really American specific bands. And that's where the
Yeah.
success kind of began and ended for the most part. Now,
Yeah, that's
obviously,
interesting because I would have assumed that these bands at least had a fairly big presence in Canada as well, because
no,
but
it's a
maybe
it's a
not.
weird
Yeah.
thing. Night Ranger's Midnight Madness album, the second one, the one with Sister Christian on it, was a gold record up here, and that's their only certified album. Um,
Wow.
Now, Kansas sold a little bit better than that. I mean, Kansas, especially in the '70s, they played a lot of big festivals up here. But yeah, it's just it's kind of the it's just turned out a lot of times my favorite bands have been those bands that are just kind of on the fringes. So they don't tour around my neck of the woods that often, but that's okay because, you know, going to shows is great, but the albums, the recorded material, that's what's going to last forever.
Yeah, exactly. And would you say, I mean, obviously you're known for being on the Contrarians at times, but is the reason that some of these bands become your favorites, is that because you are slightly contrarian and something like that appeals to you a little bit more than the things that everybody else goes for?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting thing because when I first got into sort of harder rock music, it was Bon Jovi when Slippery When Wet came out. That was the turning point for me. That was my Beatles on Ed Sullivan moment, right? And I still love that early stuff. And Def Leppard Hysteria is one of my favorite albums of all time. So it's not like I go out of my way to find obscure things, but I'll just hear a song that will just do
Right.
something and move something inside of me, and then I'll be like, who was that? Why am I not hearing that again? Why did I only hear that once? Why have I only seen the video once? That's just the way it's turned out. And it turns out a lot. And that's why, doing the Zoom calls, being on shows like that, I meet other people that like these bands just as much, or that have at least heard of them, and
Yes.
can talk to and can speak to the music. But it definitely, I don't go out of my way to do that. It turns out that way a lot of the time. And
Yeah.
then I end up championing these bands and saying, you know, this, XYZ band is great. I just happen to think these guys are at least every bit as good and should be as well known.
Yeah. And I guess that's a good way for you to work out which band you're going to write about because you've got a nice mix of
Exactly.
the passion, the knowledge, and maybe on one level at least a gap in the market. There is a fandom for these things that isn't perhaps being served by other publishers.
You hit the nail on the head, Joseph. It's like I'm a huge Kiss fan. What am I going to write about? I'm a huge Rush fan. What am I going to write about? There have been so many great books out on these bands. I don't need to dip my toe in the water. I've got no angle to come at it with that hasn't been already explored. I would rather talk about these bands that I don't hear anybody talking about. And I think that's one of the reasons why Y&T book sold so well, because this is a band that has never had a gold record. They had one that came close, but this is a band that sold millions of albums all over the world. They're big in Japan. They did fairly well in the UK and throughout Europe and pockets of the United States. Um, and there's never been a book on them. And I think every classic band should be commemorated in that way. And, I always like to say it's great that you could be able to go on the internet and go on Wikipedia and look things up, but that stuff has a limit.
Yeah.
It's not all in one place. You can't pick it up and carry it around with you. Uh, you know, uh, so I really wanted, yeah, there's no question. If I come out with a book, this is going to be a band that I've looked around and said, I'm not seeing the book. And a lot of times I'm writing the books or I'm putting the books together that I myself would like to read as a fan of these bands. And so,
It's
yeah,
the perfect way to do it.
there's, it's, there are more like niche artists and bands that I am writing about, but there's a market, there's an audience out there that will go, I can't believe someone actually wrote a book about, you know, that's to me, that's sort of the role I feel that, it just comes naturally to me. Because if someone said to me, look, we'll give you X amount, write a book about such and such, if I was not a fan, could I do it? Yes, but my heart wouldn't be in it. I would
Yeah.
rather be able to write. I hope I know that the panel books, people can tell that these people are serious about their fandom of this music. I hope
Absolutely.
people can tell by my overall construction. I'm coming at this as a fan. It's not all everything they've recorded is great, because I don't do that. That's not realistic. Nobody hits it out of the park all the time. Some people are pretty consistent and pretty good most of the time, but if there's a song that I'm not crazy about, I'm going to mention it. I'll be like, what do you guys think of this one? Yeah, it's not my favorite either. Or I kind of like it.
Yeah.
I try to, I have to be honest about these books. But
Yeah.
at the end of the day, like you know, if anybody from a band read that, I would hope they would realize that, okay, he doesn't like this one particular song, but he wrote a book about us. He's
Yeah.
obviously a fan. And,
They're not going to
especially
dump
a
on you
band
because you say you don't like one song.
especially a band that there aren't a ton of books, there aren't a ton of press on them. So it's not like I'm look, yes, I do make a little bit of money back from this. I'm not going to be able to retire on it. So I'm not doing it for financial gain.
Yeah.
It's the same reason I started my YouTube channel. And and a lot of times it's bands that I've been championing since I was in high school, or in some cases earlier than that. saying, yeah, but listen to them too. They're good. So,
One quick thing, because we are light on time, as these things always tend to be. It was quite interesting to note that we have not a dissimilar story. You're slightly older than me, if I can be allowed to say that, but we both kind of got into the 90s and grunge was happening, and we sort of said, this isn't for me, and went
oh,
back to 70s and 80s music and found things that certainly our peers would not have even dreamt of listening to. And I
that's
think maybe that's changing a bit with the current generation. They're more open to listening to older things as
yes,
well as the new.
absolutely. Yeah, you're dead on. That's absolutely how I got into Kansas. Now, the first song I ever heard by Kansas was "All I Wanted" from 1986. I saw the video for that song, and that song actually got a fair bit of radio play. It was a top 20 single, and I still love the song. That's not you wouldn't I wouldn't play that for someone that said this is what Kansas sounds like.
So,
That's an example of what they could do when they put their heads together. Let's do an AOR ballad. Okay. But it was 92. It was 1992. That's when I got into Queen and Kansas and Zeppelin and Purple and Lynyrd Skynyrd and Boston and Nazareth. Yeah, because
yeah,
I was not a grunge fan. And so I looked at the bands that I was liking from the 80s and went, well, who did they listen to? Who were their influences? And so I got into Queen in a big way. And that's another band, one of my favorites. Lots of Queen books, lots of great ones. I
yeah,
don't
exactly.
I don't have anything to add to that. But to me, when I was getting into Kansas, I kind of got into Kansas, Queen, and Zeppelin at the same time. And I remember thinking, Queen and Zeppelin are like revered. Why are Kansas not in that? Because to me, they're every bit as good. So
Yeah,
it makes sense that this would happen now. But yeah, that's very, very similar to what happened to me, which is why I've said this to a lot of people. There are songs from 1976 that seem newer to me than songs from 1986 because I was actively listening to the radio when these songs were coming out. These are songs that I had to go back and explore. And again, I'd heard the title Carry On Wayward Son years before I actually heard the song it
the
belonged
song.
to. You
Yeah,
know what I mean? So yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I would not never understood the whole grunge thing, never understood the negativity. And one of the things that I say in the Night Ranger book, one of my things that I love about that band is that their lyrics and their music is generally upbeat and positive. You know,
yeah,
they just
absolutely. That really comes through, and it's something I'm going to be listening for when I pick up a Night Ranger album or two to give a fresh listen to. So
well, you know, I'll tell you
on
if you wanted a quick start, um, the 1989 10 or 12 song greatest
oh,
hits CD.
that's one I've got, and it's usually I start with the greatest hits and leap from there. But
Okay,
that just somehow didn't translate. I don't know why, but I will give it another try. But on that note, thank you for coming on and great books. If you're a fan of either band, get them. If you're not a fan of either band, check them out because they might turn you into one. And thank you very much, Tim, for joining me. I really appreciate you coming on, and I will talk to you again. I really hope. Thanks a
thank you
lot.
very much for having me on, Joseph. Thank you.
My pleasure. Well, there we have it. Thanks again to Tim for joining me, and do make sure to check out his channel, Tim's Vinyl Confessions. I'll have that linked in the description below, along with the Amazon link where you can find all of his books for purchase. That'll be to Amazon.com, but wherever you are in the world, as Tim mentioned, your local Amazon will be able to get those to you. So do that, and it just leaves me to say thanks for watching today, and bye for now, but not for long.
Acting is reacting. This does not mean acting again.